Hi everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this evening for this webinar with Dr. Richard Pitcairn and Susan Pitcairn. Richard, of course, most of you will know he's a vet, and he was a teacher and researcher in veterinary medicine at the University of Washington. He also had a small animal practice in Oregon for 20 years, and he focused on nutrition and homeopathy. He also co-founded the Academy of Veterinary Homeopathy and the Pitcairn Institute of Veterinary Homeopathy. And his wife, Suzanne, is an award-winning artist who's also known for her poetry. And they've just recently published the 4th edition of their very popular Complete Guide to Natural Health for Dogs and Cats. So I'm delighted to have them here and very much looking forward to this webinar on healthy, humane and sustainable feeding in the 21st century. So over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. What we are planning to do today, Susan very graciously spent quite a bit of time putting together this slide presentation, which will go over the major points and major topics of this last edition of our book. So it'll give us a foundation. We're planning, if we discipline ourselves, that it'll last about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. So that's the plan. That's the plan, and we're going to try to adhere to it as best we can. So I'll turn this over to Susan, who will then go through the slides with you, and then if I can think of anything to add, I'll comment as well. Susan?
Okay, thank you. This is actually probably about the 5th time we've done this, and it's a little bit different each time for those of you that may have seen it before. So we started this with the 3 ideas of being healthy, but also being humane and sustainable. Those are the 3 important principles we like to include in our own diet and in that of animals also, as much as possible. And I think probably most people are in agreement with the principles of that. So here we are, and we live in Sedona now. That's Red Rock Crossing. And back way when, in like 1981, we wrote this first edition of our book. We were on the Merv Griffin show, sort of a farce, but anyway, there we were. And we popularized feeding carefully balanced and supplemented home-prepared diets for both dogs and cats. And so at that time, most people were feeding kibbles, and so we advocated basically grains and rice, grains and meat and supplements and little veggies and so forth, which we worked out and analyzed as best we could by hand back in those days. And the recipes worked well. And we often found that just simply switching, when people simply switch their animal to nutritionally balanced recipes of these different things, it would make a huge difference in their health. And most of them had been on kibbles before. And so for 35 years, this approach really has worked very well, for countless dogs and cats. It's been gone global, really. We have here's the 2nd edition, the 1st edition, the 2nd edition. Here it is in Italian and in German, 2 different German editions, and in Spanish there was another one too, Korean, and then this was the 3rd edition, which was just until recently on Amazon was still the #1 bestseller in small animal medicine. Now, probably this is true of many people listening today, that many people now take the diet a little step further in the natural direction, understandably, and feed mostly raw meat and some veggies and bones and so on. It's called, as you know, the raw diet. And it does not include grains in many cases, sometimes sweet potatoes or something like that. So you'll see a big zero grain, no grain kind of trend, especially since 2006 when there was a scare about some products that were coming in from China. Well, why not? Dogs are canines. They have canine teeth, much more than we do. They clearly evolved to eat meat. So you see, here's their cousin, the bear. They're in the same family. Look at those mouths. Same thing. And but like bears, they also do like their fruits and veggies. They actually seem to crave them. Somebody was just telling me yesterday that her dog just really, really seemed to want berries very much and just goes for them extremely. So whether it's the raw diet or whether it's the one that we are advocating, meat, mostly meat or partly meat, a fresh diet is clearly an improvement over commercial foods. We all know this. I mean, the things that are in commercial foods are pretty unsavory. expired meats and 4D, dead, dying, disease, disabled meats, even euthanized pets and their collars. I mean, it's just, there's in all kinds of stories. It's pretty easy, and moldy grains, rancid grains, and leftovers of the human industry, food industry. And so it's no wonder, that has made a difference. However, important as it is to feed our dogs healthy diets, how we do that really does have very important impacts on others and on the future of the world. And we had always had some emphasis on that in our book, but we have really had like an awakening on that a couple of years ago. And we're all learning things. And here's some things we'd like to share with you for your consideration. Not only, as we all know, does consuming meat, fish, eggs, and dairy clearly harm the animals from which they come, and like most poultry is factory farmed. That may not be the case as much in England as it is in the U.S., but here it's like 98%. And in conditions, just horrible conditions, really. With big trims and male chicks are smothered or in bags of plastic and thrown into grinders. I mean, because they're not useful. And even on a home, like a farm, there's castrations and things without anesthesia. A lot of times cows are slaughtered and they're still conscious and, still and they're skinned. But there's evidence that maybe as many as a quarter of them that happens here in the U.S. skinned alive. So that's clear. But something that we often don't know that much about is how key resources and agricultural conditions, ecosystems are in dangerous depletion. We may be facing some very serious problems, even in our own lives, certainly the lives of our children and our grandchildren. Our numbers are increasing. First of all, let's look at climate change. It's widely considered, a major threat to human civilization, even if there are a few holdouts in the U.S. and elsewhere that don't believe that. Only 97% of climate scientists agree on this. And the leading cause, there's some disagreement here, but some say as much as 51% of it is due to animal agriculture, primarily due to the production of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, though short-lived. And like here, you can see this is one of the reports done on that. The 51% of greenhouse gases are attributable to livestock products. By 2025, now just think about that, that's not even 10 years from now. It has been said we may lose the Amazon forest. It's being cut down at a tremendous rate. And over 90% of that goes to grazing livestock or to growing feed for them. And much of that's imported to the West, including Europe. By 2030, there are some predictions, no one knows for sure, but the huge aquifer, the Ogallala, beneath the southern Great Plains in the U.S. could go dry. And that's one of our breadbaskets. Although most of the grains that are fed, they're grown there, and the soy and the corn is fed to animals. By 2050, 2/3 of us will face water shortages. You can see that a lot of that's in Africa and in South Asia, a lot of the warm areas in Southwest here where we live. Also even in South America. Well, a major reason for this, it can take 100 times more water to produce animal versus plant protein, gram for gram. It can take like 2,500 to 8,000 gallons of water just to produce a pound of beef. By 2050, the oceans may also be empty of fish, which I'm sure that we even understand what that would do to the climate, to our oxygen levels, and to let alone to our hunger and our sustenance. Right now, half the catch goes to feed livestock, fish farms, and pets. 80% of the catch is also by-kill, includes dolphins and sharks and such like. And they just take most of these big trawlers just rape the bottom of the ocean floor and take the whole ecosystem out. It's very destructive. Some say there's no such thing as sustainable fishing. Also, the runoff from factory farms and the fertilizers that are used to grow feed crops for them is also the main cause of ocean dead zones, which are growing around the world. It's like a process called eutrophication, where there's excess nitrogen goes into the water from these sources, and it causes algal blooms and whatever that, I don't know the whole process, but it basically destroys the oxygen level for a lot of the aquatic life. Because of that, the Amazon, the water, the climate change, and habitat destruction by 2050, half of all species alive today may be extinct. We've already wiped out, 52% since 1970 of the Earth's, bird, mammal, fish, reptilian, and amphibian populations. This is like the biggest thing since the dinosaurs. And again, it's due to all these things we're doing primarily to have diets that are more rich in animal foods. By the end of the century, if this loss of water and seafood and has not already wiped us out, there's also predictions we may lose all of our topsoil. Even in Europe, in places where there's these long time seemingly sustainable farms, there's a steady loss of topsoil. This is a serious issue. Well, it's important to know that it takes about 18 times more land on average to produce the omnivorous Western diet for humans than a plant-based and a vegan one. Just having some meat in the diet. So if we continue on this course, it looks to us like we're going to face widespread human famine and drought and depopulation in this century due to our own habits. But wait, okay, there is good news. I don't want to just depress you all. Neither one of us does. What really gives us hope is that we have control over this. Getting nutrients directly from plants instead of from animals is so much more efficient. I mean, if you compare, a lot of our information comes from this wonderful film, Cowspiracy, The Sustainability Secret. It's on Netflix now, which we watched in 2014. If you look here, like a vegan diet, for one person, takes about 1/6 of an acre. A vegetarian diet with some eggs and cheese and milk and so on, about 1/2 acre. But the standard American diet, which I think is probably pretty similar to that in Europe, it takes about 3 acres a person. So that's the 18 times more than the vegan diet. And also part of the good news is right now we have enough productivity on our croplands that we could feed twice or more of the human population that we have right now. And if we would control our numbers, that means we could even actually return a lot of land to nature. Wouldn't that be beautiful? So if we want a sustainable planet, it looks like we're just going to have to consider cutting down on meat and animal product consumption as much as possible. We're not saying that everybody has to become a vegan, as we are, or that everybody can even, but that it is possible to cut down, and we should do it as much as we can. For humans, this is very attainable. In fact, the healthiest and longest lived cultures in the world eat 90 to 98% plant-based. Like in Okinawa, they ate like 70% of their traditional diet was sweet potatoes. And many people would live to be 100 routinely in good shape. You can read about that in a book, which I didn't have time to insert in this slide, called Healthy at 100 by John Robbins. Really a good book, very readable. So what about dogs? This is a dog group here. What if we could team up together with our dogs and maybe sit down and have a little bit of a talk with your dog and say, I know I've been feeding you this raw diet and you've really liked it and you've been healthy on it, but maybe there's an option. Of course, for an animal that's really used to it, it's older or sick, maybe it would be harder to change, but there's some good news about it. But before we look at the health aspects of it, let's just look at what would be the ecological impacts of it. So we asked, what if that was the case? And we working with those numbers from Cowspiracy, we found some amazing things. So a 70-pound dog, let's say, if they were eating a balanced, nutritionally complete, plant-based diet instead of raw meat, here's how much you would save the planet each day on average. 2,200 gallons of water, 60 square feet of rainforest, 90 pounds of grain, that's like, 3 big 25-pound sacks and some, 40 pounds of CO2 equivalents, enough fuel to drive 91 miles, and 2 animals' lives. So that's actually about twice what a person would say. Because they eat, let me go back to this, how I show you how I figured this. So I'm figuring that based on the caloric need, most of the calories coming from meat, it would be about 18 ounces of meat would be needed a day for this 70-pound dog. And the average American eats about 9 ounces a day, and that's how these figures were calculated by others on Cowspiracy. And so I'm just doubling them. All right, so over 11 years, let's say this dog lives 11 years, look what it adds up to. Almost 9 million gallons of water. I can't even quite conceive of what that looks like. 5.5 acres of rainforest, 180 tons of grain that would feed a lot of people that are starving now, about 1 billion in the world. 80 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, enough fuel to drive 365,000 miles, that's many times around the earth, and 8,000 animals' lives. You've got to figure all the fish and so forth that goes into feeding, even the meal that's fed to livestock. And you might think, wow, they don't eat that many cows, but it depends on what they're eating. It's all averaged out. So there's this food writer, Michael Pollen, you've probably heard of, and he's written The Omnivorous Dilemma and other books, and he estimates that a sustainable amount of meat for a person would only be about half a burger, about 2 ounces a week. Okay, and we're talking about 18 ounces a day for this dog. I mean, that's a huge amount more than what would be considered sustainable. I mean, they don't even talk about animals in these films. We're kind of broaching this topic, I think, as far as we know, among the first. I've seen a little bit of stuff online on the subject of the ecological impact of meat-fed pests, but back in the old days when we just fed the leftovers, the kibble stuff, maybe it was more sustainable actually. So we decided to do an update. Goodbye to the old book and the old ways of feeding, and hello to our new edition. And here we are, a little bit older, a little bit wiser. And this over here in the corner is one of the recipes that one of the people who collaborated with us on our new book created for a boutique kind of dog food kitchen in New York City, and that this is a well-known vegan dog food brand. Anyways, first we looked to see, before we got into all this detail, if dogs have ever done well on plant-based diets. We asked around and we heard from some people who had been kind of familiar with this, about 100% could do it. So we looked and see what kind of results. And it seems very counterintuitive, right? And it's surprising to us too, as it may be. Here's what we found. First, some 11,000 years ago, the early dogs adapted away from their wolf ancestors and were able to digest the starches of civilization. Their amylase genes actually increased in number by quite several times. So people have learned this in recent years from sequencing DNA from wolves compared to 60 dogs belonging to 14 breeds. And they came up with this, a Swedish geneticist. And then this is just, I think, about the same study here. And so what they're saying, like back in this last one, is like Fido may prefer steak, yeah, but its digestive system is actually geared up for rice and potatoes. And that dogs evolved to eat a much more varied diet than wolves. And the same thing happened to people at the same time, when people became farmers. Our genes changed too. So those who've never been farmers, actually, like native peoples, maybe some of them like the Inuit, they don't have such an adaptation so much. Okay, now the next thing, we looked and we found that ancient writers actually recommended feeding mostly grains, beans, and whey to dogs. Perhaps a few dregs from the stew pot. Some even advised against eating meat. You can read about this on the article on dog food on Wikipedia. There's quotes from different authorities in the past. Like here's a Columnella, whatever. I'm assuming this is a Roman who's advocated eating barley meal mixed with whey. or if you don't have that, then wheat bread mixed with the liquid from cooked beans. So that's what they were feeding, and obviously dogs survived all this time, right? Were able to reproduce. Currently, we hear reports of, indirectly and some directly, of thousands of dogs that have thrived on well-balanced commercial and fresh vegan diets. Many people started doing this in at least the 1970s. And one of them is right there in England, Anne Heritage from Somerset. She raised some dogs to advanced old age. She fed the same thing every day, pretty much. A stew of lentils, brown rice, textured soy protein, nutritional yeast for the B12 and extra vitamins, and lots of fresh veggies from her garden. And they also got a lot of exercise and love, and they had companionship and all these things. And together, their lifestyle, the oldest one lived to be 25, was the oldest dog in the world at the time, and their pal Floyd lived to 20. And then she had a German Shepherd that lived to 15, longer than the breed usually does. And then our friend Alan Schoen, a veterinarian, was telling us about a client who brought her dog in for the first vet visit at age 20. And she was exceptionally sparkly and healthy for any age, she said. They gave her a thorough exam, did blood tests and all that. Her diet, a varied fresh food vegan diet like her person was eating, with healthy omega-3 oils and superfood supplements. And so that was pretty amazing. This is a mixed breed, mid-sized dog. We don't really have a picture. In fact, though, a number of veterinarians actually have been advocating and feeding vegan diets, especially to dogs, such as Dr. Andrew Knight, who's British and Australian, and he's more of an ethicist, really, but he's written a lot on this. And then Lorelei Wakefield from Pennsylvania in the U.S., and she's done some studies also. Dr. Armighty May from Los Angeles. She has a website called veganvet.com. And then James Peden, an important figure. This is his current dog, and he started out with dark hair and dark long hair, but anyway, he looks quite different. But he and his wife approached us back actually in the 1980s, saying in Oregon when we were living there, saying that they had developed some products to help be able to feed cats on a vegan diet. We were thinking, no way, and it turned out their cat was hunting, so we thought, well, that doesn't really prove that it works. So we kind of blew it off at the time. I wish we paid a little bit more attention. But meanwhile, the Pedens developed these products, including Veggie Dog, which help animals to eat a more balanced and complete vegan diet. So they would have things like B12 in it, and vitamin D, and zinc and choline and different things that just can be a little bit low on plant-based diets. Although there are plenty of people who've done it without this. These veggie pet products are now produced by this company who sold to Compassion Circle, and we consulted with those folks in formulating our new recipes. We wanted to see, they were updating the formulas, and so we worked together and did a lot of calculations and made sure that their recipes and that our recipes were all nutritionally complete and meet the official feeding standards. And we were using the American Association of Feeding Control Officers for our guidelines, how many milligrams of this or that were needed per 1,000 calories. So another person we encountered who has some YouTube videos is Jan Allegretti, and she's raised herself several Great Danes to exceptional ages. They were rescues at like age 6 to start with. And again, feeding pretty much what she would eat as a vegan and some supplements. She sometimes would feed people multiple vitamins, I think, as well. And omega-3 oils, hemp oil, and things like that. And nut butters, fruits, as snacks, and broccoli and whatnot. A real varied diet. Her whole thing is being flexible and being varied. And so her program is called the Fresh and Flexible Program, and she kindly loaned it to us to use in our book. And it can be done with meat also. It's kind of a proportion program. Now here's another gal, Sanai Suzuki, who has written a book that's come out recently called Healthy Happy Pooch. And she's raised a ton of dogs. And both she and Jan, the last person, have also had many clients, and they advise that are doing this successfully. And she emphasizes at least half beans, in her recipes, well mashed and so on. And she's had her recipes analyzed also by a veterinary nutritionist. And so they're excellent books, and they also her book is, both of these two actually, really good books with a lot of good advice on just caring for your dog and lifestyle issues, and general care. So there's also some other books here. This one's just come out. Another British author who's come out, Plant-Based Recipes for Dogs. Heather Costner is her name. It's kind of hidden here. And this, The Simple Little Vegan Dog Book, has been out for a while. Michelle Rivera. She used to live on the farm in Tennessee, kind of an old hippie commune. It's actually vegan. And then also, this is one of the things that really got my attention, was I found this when I was searching 100 vegan eating dogs. There's lots of stories of dogs that switched from eating kibbles or raw meat or whatever to eating vegan and did just fine and lived a long time. So they're onto something. Plus, meanwhile, there's been a number of vegan dog kibbles and canned foods, and they have really surprisingly good reviews, with a lot of glowing reports of dogs who had skin, ear, eye, coat problems, and their energy level really improved, after they switched to this. And probably in most cases they were going from kibble to kibble. So you might say, well, okay, it's something that's maybe not as good as the raw diet or whatever. I can't say, but there's not been studies done on this so far. But we've also gotten good feedback about those commercial foods, as well as fresh foods, from friends, clients, from other vets, like our friend Mary Beth Minter, who I think might be online now, lives in Sedona, and her dog Rudy. He's a real jumper. He likes to play, and he does get little bits of meat from her husband, and he gets both fresh food and also commercial food, vegan. And then our friend Felicia Thompson and her older dog Teddy, they switched to a fresh food vegan diet. He's a rescue, and he's doing just great, and his health has improved, and his kidney values and things too. And then look at this beautiful dog. This is James Peden's dog, and she was one of the models for the illustrations in our book, which I got to do this time. So you might ask, why? Why would so many dogs not only do as well on a plant-based diet, but even have, improvements like better coat health, energy, longevity? We don't know for sure. Again, there's not long-term studies yet, comparing, like they've done with people, where they have maybe 100,000 people in the study. That's really significant. But, no one's done this so far, so we're kind of paving the way here. Obviously, other people have come before us, but we're encouraging you. Here's a clue why this might be what we think. Could it be toxins? Richard particularly thinks this. Toxins, there's like some 100,000 chemicals, right, that have been approved without really being vetted properly, tested on their health effects in our environment today. And I
can add, most of them have not been tested for, like probably 80-90% have not been tested for health effects in people. And just forget other animals. It's not even a question to the government.
Nor to veterinarians, but it is known that some, I've heard different figures, but actually some more like even 90 to 95% of environmental toxins come into our bodies through one way, eating animal foods. Well, the reason I had this tuna here is that they concentrate up the food chain, and particularly that's why they're in fish, large ocean fish like tuna, because they eat fish who eat fish who eat fish. Now, because
I might add, if you don't know, that what she just referred to about concentration is called bioaccumulation. And the significance is that every level going up the food chain, the animals eaten by other animals, it's concentrated by many thousands and thousands of times the amount that's in their tissues.
And sometimes millions of times more than the amount in surrounding water, like dioxins or things like that. So, and because these toxins concentrate in fatty tissues where they get stored because the body doesn't know what to do with them, they're especially high in milk, cheese, butter, eggs, and fatty meats. And there have been tests done to prove that. Also, studies have found, for example, this was several decades ago, I'm sure it's more than this by now, that meat has 14 times more pesticides than plant foods, and that's not even organic plant foods. And dairy, like 4.5 times more. We were vegetarians for a long time, and I kind of shudder to think how much we took in through all the cheese we ate, and all the butter and milk and eggs and so on, because they're all very high-fat foods. Meat is too. Meat is actually usually more fat than it is protein. I don't know if you knew that. I didn't really quite appreciate that until I started doing some nutritional analysis. So now adding slaughterhouse waste, like the 4D meats and fish meal, to animal feed, which is done routinely, even for our herbivores like cows, and also to pet foods, this just compounds the problem. It's easy to disguise all this in kibbles, especially because they're just mixed together, and extruded in high heat, and they add yummy flavors and stuff. So because of this difference, this is why studies have also shown that vegans' bodies have far smaller levels of pesticides and dioxins and persistent organic compounds and so on. 99% of U.S. mother's milk has significant levels of DDT, but just 8% of vegetarian moms in one test. Here, a test was done with 35 times more chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides in breast milk of meat eaters than in vegetarians and vegans. Now, had they even just compared it to vegans, it would have been even, I think, different. More different.
If I might add here a comment, just so you understand the significance of this, you might think, why are we talking about breast milk? Again, going back to the idea of a food chain, that is starting down at the bottom with microorganisms and plankton and up to plants and then to animals and animals that eat other animals and so on. And it's getting more and more concentrated. The top of the food chain, at least in the US, is human beings, dogs, and cats. So they're going to have the most of these contaminants in their bodies. There's one level above humans, dogs, and cats, and that is babies, because they feed off their mothers. So the reason for studies looking at breast milk is because they're going to find the highest levels of chemicals that are possibly present today.
And indeed, here's an example where they've comparing vegans. They did have one test here that it's only 1 to 2% of the levels of toxins that there is in the population as a whole. So this could also be why 8 out of 10 of the top food allergens for dogs are actually from animal-based foods. We've got beef, dairy, eggs, chicken, lambs, and pork, rabbits, and fish. Now, wheat and soybeans are also on that list, but maybe that's because those particular plants have been heavily treated with Roundup, with glyphosate, and so on, as we all know. Wheat is treated to dry it out before harvest, and then soybeans, of course, are one of the primary GMO crops. So one of the things we looked at here was the glyphosate issue, which accumulates in most of us and in livestock that's fed these things, and then that's been found to be in their tissues too.
I could add to that too. A study came out a few months ago here in the U.S. that 98% of people in the United States have Roundup in their urine.
And a German study linked it with levels of chronic disease. Like, this correlates really well, and with things like also gluten issues, celiac disease, leaky gut, and so on. It may be actually causing leaky gut. So, and then this is just showing how wheat has been having more and more herbicides applied to it. Some 97% of spring wheat and some 61% of winter wheat, just to dry it out. And so there it is, desiccating non-organic wheat crops. That's what's been happening to our bread. It doesn't happen so much in Europe, and that's why a lot of Americans who travel there find that they digest grains from bread and wheat better there. A special concern for pet food is heavy metals. It's extremely high in many commercial pet foods, and we can assume also in fresh foods. Particularly be aware of mercury in seafood. It really concentrates there. Arsenic in chicken. Arsenic is actually fed to chicken. It's to control parasites, right, Richard? It's
an organic arsenic compound that's to control coccidia and also to give the flesh of the chicken when it's eaten to have a better appearance to people.
So important. And then lead in bones. Lead is in the same place on the periodic chart of the elements as calcium. So sometimes the bones will take up an exceptional amount of lead. We actually had to stop recommending U.S. Bone meal many years ago because of contamination with lead. So this is a study that has been done. You can find it on the truthaboutpetfood.com. And the most outstanding things that really got our attention was like mercury. It was like 30 times the reference dose limit for humans in cat food, and kind of comparing it pound per pound. And mercury was 120 times more in dog food samples that were done. Pretty shocking. So all right, so let's move on here. Now that we kind of figured out that this looks like a good idea, we decided to come up with a bunch of options in our book. We still have ways that you can feed meat if you want to do it, so don't think that's entirely plant-based. It's not. But we have a lot of palatable recipes that we've checked out that dogs and cats like, particularly dogs, and that so they emphasize legumes, tofu or beans, peas sometimes, lentils especially are well digested, and seeds, and sometimes textured soy protein or vital wheat gluten, more in the cat recipes where it was needed more to get the protein up. And they're all carefully analyzed. This stew here, lentil stew, is in our book, and it's based on that, as best I could figure it out, on the same thing that Bramble ate, the one that lived to age 25. And savory stew is similar recipe, a little bit more yummy and people friendly. It's got tomato and stuff in it. It's very good. And then Malibu stew is this beautiful mix in collaboration with Shuna Deguchi of Malibu Dog Kitchen in New York. And you can see the ingredients on the lower part here, and here it's mushed together, and she sells it fresh. But you can make it. Wild tofu is just something, this is actually for cats, but dogs would like it too, and it just really works well for them. Matches their protein and fat needs with added nutritional yeast. Dog garbanzos. Okay, this is what this gal eats. And she primarily it's garbanzos, and with some supplements, a little bit of veggies and this and that. But you can see their recipe from, if you buy the Veggie Dog supplement, they have recipes with it. And this particular one, dog garbanzos, which we've also put in our book, is the primary food eaten by Jasmine Rose, this great dog here. And a lot of dogs and cats both like garbanzos, which are kind of high in fat compared to other beans. And then we also have some like tofu meatloaf, bean burgers, tofu noodles, burritos, and so forth. Different kinds of just things that you can eat yourself. So we call them pets plus people recipes. And the point is to make it easier for you than ever to fix fresh food at home. And the new supplements are these Veggie Dog and Veggie Cat supplements, which we talked about. It replaces our old healthy powder. It's a lot easier and it's more complete. And they source them well. This is a company that's owned now by a naturopath, very conscientious. And we're kind of coming to the end of our time. We want to allow some time for question and answer, so I'm going to whiz through this a little bit more. But I just want to show you how we did a complete nutritional analysis. This is on a website, much easier than when we used to do it by hand. So they're all analyzed carefully. Nutritionfacts.com or nutritiondata.com, excuse me. And so you can see like amino acid scores, completeness, and just the different levels of everything. So and then we would put it into a program and compare it on per 1,000 calories. We spent a lot of time on spreadsheets on this thing. Maybe too much, but we wanted to be sure. And as a result of that, we were able to kind of devise some homemade prescription diets that work best for particular conditions like weight loss, allergies, diabetes, kidney disease, depending on the parameters, macronutrients usually like, more protein, less protein, more fiber, less, and so forth, that are appropriate for different conditions. We also have some flexible, broad programs. If you wanted, for example, to still feed the meat, you can cut down on it using Dr. D. Blanco's program, which is basically a hot cereal breakfast. This is our breakfast, but basically like a steel cut oats or something for breakfast with maybe a little bit of fruit, maybe some nuts if they like that. Doesn't have to be that, and some milk, or it could be plant-based milk. And then at the end of the day, you could feed the raw diet. And then we also have these flexible broad programs like Jan Allegretti's program that's based on percentages, of legumes and carbs and fats. And it's a very simple, intuitive program that's worked quite well for her and her clients. And yes, we even have some packaged foods for convenience, travel, backup treats that we recommend. And as we said, these vegan kibbles are good. They're free of a lot of problems, and they get good reviews. A lot of people have found improvements. Oops, I was missing something. But it's better though to supplement with fresh food. And if you do that, make sure that it has enough protein in it. You don't want to just add a lot of fruit to something like that. All right, so packaged foods, it's best to alternate it or mix it with fresh foods. Here's some that we like, particularly V-Dog. They've had thousands of clients that have done well. The dogs have done well on it. Some living to age 20 just on kibble. And Natural Balance Vegetarian Dry Dog Formula. And there's also Benevo. I think, I'm not sure they actually have that. It's a UK brand, but I'm not sure they have a dog version. But anyway, you might have to look around there in the UK. But this one gets really good reviews. It's a little cheaper. And then we have some handouts also. If you search Susan Pitcairn diet handouts online, you'll find this postcard, and you'll also find this 2-page handout, which just kind of summarizes some of our favorite recipes. Here's a lentil stew, there's a burger, there's savory stew, a tofu meatloaf. This is really delicious, and animals love it. And then also another handout we made a year before, which is Jan Allegretti's diet with the different proportions of protein and carbs and so on, and then some other recipes and supplements, treats, etc. that we recommend. So just again, go to Susan Pitcairn diet handouts, and you can download these. And while you're at it, you might look at our handout for feeding yourself a more plant-based diet. I mean, again, you don't have to do this 100% of the time or at all, but I'd say, give it a try for a while and see how you feel. A lot of people, their health actually improves. So now it's time for some questions and answers. So we'll switch it over now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If anybody wants to type any questions in the chat box, I will read them out. I'll kind of start with one. I love this idea of pets and people actually cooking meals for both of you at the same time. I think it's great. You mentioned the supplement Veggie Dog. I'm not sure that that's actually available in the UK. Do you know if there's anything similar?
Yeah, I believe you can get it. That's a good question. I believe you can get it online, but we also give a substitution in our book, and it's spelled out there. But it basically involves like using a good human multiple vitamin, and then you can use a calcium supplement in it, and there's at a similar level actually as the Veggie Pet, like such as there's one called Animal Essentials. I don't know if you can get it there. It's algae based, and we like it because it's got less contamination than a bone meal based, and it's more humane and sustainable.
Yeah. So
there's ways to get around it. But there's also a product that's made in Australia. I don't know if that makes it more available to you or not, but I think it's called. It's got a similar name, Veggie. I can't remember the name of it, but it's something similar to Veggie Pet, Vegetarian Pets or something. And just put that in with Australia if you want to give that a shot. But really, you can do it for dogs pretty easily. And a lot of people have not even used vitamins at all. Like if you look at that little vegan dog book, they fed dogs for years on recipes that if I analyzed them, looked to me like they'd be a little bit deficient on protein. But they seem to be working. So
yeah, okay.
We had more research.
Right, let's go through these questions. First of all is from Brigitte. So thank you very much, very interesting. The vegan diet seems to mean dogs and cats can no longer have any bones, which they enjoy so much. And I have to say, yeah, I do enjoy seeing my dogs gnaw on a bone. It's kind of good for their soul. When I had a litter of puppies, they really, really did enjoy, at 5-6 weeks. It seemed to be very, very good for them. So I think that's kind of a good point. What's your thoughts on that?
I might raise a question because I don't know, but in your country, was there a time when you used leaded gasoline in your cars?
Yeah.
Well, that's the situation here. For several decades, we used leaded gasoline, and the reason that lead was added to gasoline was so that the engine would run quieter. And the problem was it spewed out the exhaust, vent for decades all over the land. So we're very contaminated with lead.
Right. Yeah.
The lead then is taken up by plants and animals, ends up in the bones of livestock. So that in this country, you cannot legally use the bones of livestock as a nutritional supplement for humans because it's got too much lead in it. Nonetheless, they've been putting it into animal food for a long time, even though it's too toxic for people to eat. So I don't know what the situation is.
Right, but there are options for chewing. There's if you look at that diet handout that I recommended, the second one, where it gives different treats and things like that. There's products that are made that are like chewable kinds of things, like they might be dried sweet potatoes or whatever, but you can also use carrots and raw broccoli and things like that, and they enjoy chewing on a lot of different things. And so in our book, we go into some of those options also. I also see a question here, what impact on behavior can a vegan diet have for dogs? That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And Jan Allegretti, who has a lot of experience with this, more than we do, tells us that she has observed that a lot of dogs calm down. I mean, not sluggish, but they become just more well behaved when they switch diets. And again, why would this be? I mean, it could be adrenaline and things like that.
Yes, I can share some information on that. We don't know for certain, of course, because we don't have the testing and the detailed studies. But we know that mercury is very high in dogs. A few tests have been done of times or more what it is in humans. So it's at a very toxic level. Well, mercury affects the brain very strongly. And there is enough information as to what mercury used to do because it was used as a medicine in people. Some of the side effects of mercury in human beings is excitement, tendency towards anger, actually in humans a desire to kill other people, the overreactive aggression, and so on. So it's very possible that mercury in the meat is causing animal excitability, maybe even seizures, for all we know.
Yes, I see another question here. Someone who came across plant-based diets reading the China study, and she sees the benefits, and is it acceptable to lessen meats in a dog's diet? Absolutely. So particularly if you've been feeding the raw diet, and that's what your dog's used to eating, and the gut bacteria and so forth are going to be adapted more to that, it would be advisable to do this gradually and see how they do. And they might, we've been learning that the gut bacteria are a lot of what causes us to have cravings, by the way, for different kinds of food they're wanting to be fed. So
what about, just going kind of back to the bones that we're talking about, we often give to a dog because they clean teeth. So do you find that chewing on, I don't know, raw carrots and things like that, or are there other things that can help to clean the teeth if we're not feeding bones? Or do you find that if you're feeding a vegan diet that actually the teeth aren't getting as much tartar on them? And
right, that's a good question. And our impression from what we hear from different people is that it's necessary it can be helpful to brush the teeth, and also that the chews and so forth are important. I think I've just kind of watched that one.
Yeah, it's something that we don't know for certain. That's a good question. I think those are the kind of things we have to find out. In other words, one way of putting it is the physical action of chewing bones to clean teeth is a reasonable trade-off considering the possible toxicity from eating the bones themselves. Yeah. That's what we don't know.
Right.
Going back to mercury, for example, a very common symptom of mercury are affections of the mouth, gums, and the gums become inflamed and red. There's more calculus built up, and so on. Lead also has some effects on the mouth. So, we don't really know the answer to that. It may be that doing it occasionally is fine. It's really a dosage. How much, if they are taking lead or mercury from the bones and other things, how much of it can they tolerate without getting sick? That's what we don't know.
Then someone asks, is there a way for testing for mercury? She's talking about a hyper kind of dog. And another good question. And yes, there are ways to do that. And there's laboratories that can do that. We have I think we put that in the book, but I know we did that in a seminar we've done recently.
There are labs that will test for heavy metals. But again, it's a little more complicated because these metals tend to get stored in tissues. Like Susan was saying, it gets stored in fat and other places. So you can test the blood, but it doesn't necessarily tell how much is stored, you see. It's a little tricky. Mm-hmm. So there are sometimes procedures where you can give a chemical that draws it out of the tissues, and then you can test it. I don't know if I would go that far myself, but
some say that
I think it makes a lot more sense just to avoid taking it in.
But you might want to know, and I've heard that the fecal tests are probably the best ones. And someone asks, how long will mercury remain in the body?
Your whole lifetime, unless you are able to eliminate it. It's not. The body doesn't know what to do with it. See, that's the problem. It's like it's not a mechanism for really getting rid of it. It may gradually go down. But believe it or not, one of the sources of mercury for environmentally is from graveyards, because they found that decomposing bodies release mercury into the environment. I didn't know that. Well. So it's there all your life unless you can stop putting it in.
A lot of mercury comes from just odd things you wouldn't think, like gold mining and other things like that. And a lot of it spreads over the ocean and where it concentrates into fish. Let me see if there's any questions.
The primary source in our culture is from burning coal.
Yeah, someone's posted the links to our handouts here. Good, thank you. And let me see the other questions we missed here. Thank you for your compliments there. And
what about raw vegetables versus cooked vegetables? I know legumes and beans. Right. We're having to, we have to cook, and I stick things in the slow cooker and just leave them, which is great. Right. But what about raw is it okay to cook absolutely everything, or should the dogs be having
I wish we had a definitive answer to that. We've seen people doing both, and generally the people who have been doing it the longest period of time seem to cook them more, I'd say, but like strawberries or something like that, fruits and so forth, are often fed raw, like they would get it in nature. But generally speaking, and also especially with legumes, it seems to be important to cook them well. And I want to add on this topic of digestion that many people do find it's helpful to use digestive enzymes, and so they'll sprinkle that on the food. So that's something we also mentioned in the book, and you can monitor the fecal material to see if there's evidence of undigested food coming through, and either mash it better, like really mash the beans and so forth, and the grains, and cook them well, or else add the digestive enzymes.
Yeah.
Now, any other questions or comments? I imagine that for some people, you're probably going, no. So let us know if that's what you're thinking. Our own thoughts about this are just that the environmental, and at least here in the U.S., the humane issues are so extreme that we really have to start thinking outside the box. And we are so encouraged also just to learn that in history that dogs have done actually quite well on bread, and a little bit of beans and stuff. So they're more flexible, I think, than we give them credit for.
Yeah, I think probably most of it, we don't kind of have any experience of this to fall back on, and I think that's kind of one of it's kind of new territory, isn't it? And I think until maybe asked us in 6 months' time, it will be actually interesting if anybody actually did take the plunge and to come back and actually say, well, how are your dogs? How did you find it? How did you, did they help you see better?
A slow cooker, someone suggests, and that, yes, we use a slow cooker for our own diet too. There's one called Instant Pot. I don't know if it's available. Instant Pot in the UK, probably it's on Amazon, and it's a lot of people that we know are just loving it. You can just push the bean button and walk away. And then somebody says also that I've been busily avoiding grains all this time. I've had a dog, but what are your views on this? Yeah, the grains.
We recommended cooked grains from the first edition of our book and have never changed that. I don't know why people stopped using them. There's no scientific evidence that they can't use them.
Right. If you Google the subject, can dogs digest grains, or we found several veterinarians that said this did not come from the profession. And there's been a lot of research done by dog food and cat food makers to see whether they can digest carbohydrates in various levels and so forth.
There have been studies done with young dogs, feeding them basically primarily grains, cooked grains up until adulthood, and they've done just fine with no symptoms. They find close to 100% digestibility.
So this one veterinarian we found, in her view on it's from Animal Medical Center in Chicago, I believe it was, Donna Solomon, I think. She says, this probably is just kind of a hype in a way to sell, more new kinds of premium dog foods to people at premium prices. And so a lot of it did begin with a pet food scare where there was a grain product that came in from China that was contaminated. Our book sales really shot up at that point. People thought, oh, we better feed a fresh food diet and know what's in it and feed everything organic and so on. But also the efforts of Billinghurst and others in the 1990s, kind of concurrent with the Atkins diet, zone diet, eat for your blood type diet, and all these things are basically diets to get people to eat more meat and less carbohydrates. That's been an influence that's going on in our culture, and the way we see it now, it can't continue. There's not really a choice. I mean, maybe for a few years for those that have the money to do it, but not for the world.
I might add too, just so you understand that, I want to emphasize that I think a lot of the chronic diseases we're seeing as animals go through their lives and get older. For example, they're saying now in this country, in the U.S., it's now estimated by veterinary profession that 1 out of 2 dogs will have cancer in their lives. This is unbelievable.
Right.
And I think a lot of it is these chemicals that are accumulating in our bodies, many of which are carcinogens. And they're finding, for example, in testing in people, up to 300 chemicals in our tissues. And dogs and cats, when they've been tested, have as many or more. There's not as many tests in dogs and cats as in people, of course. But when it has been done, they have higher levels in humans. So I think a lot of what you're facing when you have illness, not necessarily that it occurs when they're younger, but as they get older and accumulate more of this substance, you see. So this is where it gets tricky, because you might have the experience of switching your animal over from a kibble to a raw food diet, primarily meat, and see them get healthier, which they would. Of course, it's more nutritious. But as the years go by and these chemicals build up in their tissues and they develop other problems, then you're not going to know that it's due to the meat you've been feeding. And your veterinarian's certainly not going to know that either. They're going to be using drugs to suppress symptoms, and you're going to find yourself into a very difficult situation at that point.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or concerns? Again, we would encourage you to give it a try, and for yourself too. I mean, a lot of people, it may or may not be, we don't know for certain that every single dog or every single person can thrive on a plant-based diet, but there is a lot of evidence that, in large, especially for humans in large population studies, that they actually do better, and probably, and it's more clear for us. I mean, we're primates, so we don't have claws, and we don't have canines really, so we see in color, so we can spot fruit and stuff like that. The fact that dogs are in the same family as bears and are omnivorous by nature gives them a real leg up on this. For cats, it's harder. For cats, it's like maybe 2/3 can do it, and we go into more detail on that in the book for those of you that have cats as well.
So are there any, this perhaps a question for Richard, any diseases that dogs have where you would actually say a vegetarian diet or vegan diet isn't actually applicable, or is it something that you can just try? So
okay, there's some
that dogs have where you'd actually say that is.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have a quick answer to it. I think probably if you have an animal that has a chronic disease, it's really best to work with a veterinarian that could guide you in that. I would say if your animal even though it has a chronic condition, if it can eat well enough, in other words, it doesn't have a problem necessarily with digestion or a problem like cats will have sometimes where they won't eat. But they have normal appetite and they're able to digest food. I think they probably do better, because it's just sort of common sense to me. I mean, if what I'm saying makes sense to you, that if you're feeding a food that has some poisonous material in it, some toxic material, it just makes sense to feed less of it or not at all. You're bound to help. It just makes sense. It's bound to help. And at the same time, if you keep feeding that meat that has, say, chemicals that are responsible for the symptoms, no matter what drugs you use, you're still going to have the problem, right?
Yeah. Logical. Someone asked about cancer. Would it be what would a low carb? What about carbs in the diet of a dog with cancer? It's kind of related to what he was saying. I mean, there's no reason to avoid carbs in cancer. It's a misunderstanding. This whole thing about somehow the carbohydrates feed cancer is simply not correct. I don't know where that comes from. Here's someone who does a vegan diet several days a week. Let's miss this here. Has a weight issue and certainly knows on those days she seems to be more energetic. Well, that's interesting. So it can only be good for her. So veggie seems a good way to go. Yeah, the energy levels, increased energy levels without being hyper. It seems it's something that people report often. Let me go back for a moment to this thing with the cancer, because I think it is one. It's something that needs clarification. It's sometimes said that sugar feeds cancer cells, and you should avoid carbohydrates as a result because carbohydrates are converted to sugar. So the first thing to understand is all the food that's eaten is converted to sugar. That's what your body lives on. All the cells in your body live on sugar, on blood glucose. And the cancer cells, yes, they use it too, but they don't use it as efficiently. So it doesn't make any sense to say that sugar feeds cancer any more than it says that sugar feeds all of your body tissues, and you can't avoid it. So you have to think in terms of avoiding perhaps an imbalanced diet or a toxic diet. Makes a lot more sense. And there's a question here that relates to this that's very important, I think, that we answer. Brigitte says to all, I see dangers in chemicals sprayed onto crops and plants, and the idea of feeding almost exclusively greens and grains would increase the poisonous material in their bodies, plus GM food. Well, I thought maybe we made this more clear, but some studies, like Michael Greger, who's an MD that follows this kind of research all the time, and he has a webcast every day called nutritionfacts.org, and he has done a study. He goes through the whole long thing to get to this point, but says that if you can't afford to buy organic grains and veggies, there's a certain risk, in the chemicals that come in on that. But the risk was like 3 compared to like 97 for animal products. So in other words, for the same reason we said that all the toxins and so forth accumulate in animal products, this is kind of, it's really the opposite of what you're saying here. The chemicals that are sprayed on the crops and plants, they're important, but they're not as bad as when they accumulate in the animal tissues. And you can also better afford to buy organic grains and vegetables when you're not buying meat. Yeah, just to add to that, make it maybe more clear, is that yes, there are these. If you are not using organic and you use vegetables or grains that have things sprayed on them, yes, that's not good. However, as Susan said, it's like maybe less than 5% of what you're going to find if you're feeding meat, because the animals that eat those grains and things that have been sprayed accumulated in their body thousands and thousands of times. So what you're doing is you're giving them a very large dose by feeding them the animal's body. Now, if you, for some reason, you could also consider, if you are feeding some meat, maybe trimming off some of the fat, if that works in your particular situation, or feeding lower fat meats like turkey, say. Chicken is actually only like 23% protein or something like that. With chicken with skin, the rest of it's pretty much fat. You go look it up on nutritiondata.com, and you might be surprised to see, like some meat like deer and turkey, it's like maybe 50% protein, 50% fat. But generally most meats are primarily, their calories are derived from fat, which in a way kind of means empty calories too. So plant foods have a lot more vitamins and minerals in most cases than animal foods do. They're much more nutrient dense per calorie, which is the modern way that food's analyzed, as I understand it. It used to be more, percentage of dry weight and so forth when we first did our book, but now it's percentage of calories, and there's long arguments as to why it's done that way and why it's more effective.
Yes, some of the superfoods are highly nutritious, aren't they? Like wheat grass and those things. Hugely nutritious.
Plants are the basis of the food chain on planet Earth. I mean, they're the ones that are getting the energy directly from the sun and bringing the minerals up from the soil. And so everything else is just kind of the middle animal. You're getting your nutrition through the middle animal or the middle fish or whatever. For example, you don't get your DHA from a fish. You can get it from algal sources, which is where the fish get it from. So there's a vegan DHA products we use, there's one called omega-3. So that helps save the fish in the oceans too, and still helps you get your healthy omega-3s. Any other questions? Let's see.
Anybody else? Any more questions
or comments? Anybody tried this?
Is anybody going to try this? Has it really made you think about it? Has it made you say, "Oh, yes," or actually no? Any comments on it? Yeah, it certainly made me. Think.
Or maybe it's just planted a seed. It's something you need to think about, and we encourage you to look at our book too, and you can get it right now on Kindle if you wanted to. No shipping overseas, and check it out. Or try those recipes online that we have done, and just see what your dog thinks of it. You might again want to mix it, maybe 50-50 with the current food, and just see what they think. See what you think of them.
Yeah. Do you find it actually any dogs that really don't like these kind of recipes or not? Have you found?
Dogs are pretty. They eat a lot of stuff, right? Cats are a little different story, but dogs will eat many things. Aren't quite as discriminating they'll eat poop, right? So. No, we haven't particularly found that some will still prefer, meat if given a choice. I mean, a lot of people will too. It has a strong flavor, a lot of salt, and a lot of chewiness and all that kind of thing. So one of the things that we find actually with ourselves, even in terms of palatability, is if you're switching from a more meat-based diet or dairy-based or whatever, eggs and stuff, and you're missing some of those kinds of foods, and this would apply to your dog too. Look for the kind of flavor that's maybe really what you like about it. You like the saltiness, the creaminess, the chewiness, the texture. I mean, what is it you're missing there? And there are substitutes that give you that same kind of palatability, like that tofu meatloaf. I mean, carnivores love that. I mean, human carnivores love that, and dogs love it too. So I shouldn't say carnivores, but meat eaters. Yeah. So. Tofu actually has a lot more protein in it as a percentage of calories than most meats. It's like 40% protein, and a lot of meats are like 25-30%. Like a hamburger is like maybe 25% protein, depending on the level.
I think that's a very, very good point. I think we don't actually appreciate how nutritious these other foods are. Right. I think that's a really, really important thing to.
And check this out too. Like different species have different protein needs. Okay, and we know this partly by the levels in their mammalian milk. So like for humans, for example, it's only human breast milk is only like 6% protein as a percentage of calories, 6-7%. Brown rice is like 10-11%. Potatoes, you can live on just those foods alone. We can. For dogs, they need like 18%. So we definitely calculated the recipes with that in mind. So like the tofu meatloaf, for example, is more than enough protein for your dog. For you could just use it as an entree and have some salad and fruit or potatoes or something on the side.
Yeah. So I can just see me and my dog sitting down at the same table, eating the same dinner.
Yeah.
Why not?
Have you seen those videos where the dogs are kind of, have you seen those where they're kind of eating?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Thank you for your comments there. Somebody said makes sense. It's nice to hear these things from people, because we do feel like we've gotten some flack from people who say, oh, this is like so unnatural, it's cruel, and you know, and it's not cruel if they're thriving and they're doing well and they like it, and think of the cruelty that's saving, you know, all those other animals, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things we really try to emphasize in this book, and Richard even has a poem in there, you know, is just, if you love animals, why not use this as an opportunity to express your love for all animals and also for the planet that we live on. You know, love is something that's really universal, true love, you know, as opposed to attachment. And so we wanted to find a way to bridge to that greater love.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if some of people's reluctance is the fact that they don't want to face up in some respects to that animal cruelty, and that it's easy to kind of turn a blind eye to it, isn't it, and not actually think about, you know, what you're feeding your dogs, and
Mm-hmm.
so I just wonder if some of the kind of reluctance to look at this is I don't really want to think about it, I just want to feed my bag of kibble.
Well, and people don't like change. Human beings resist change, you know, but you can embrace change and realize, and it's for me, it's given me a strong sense of purpose the last few years. Someone says I feel a little depressed when I think about what's going on in the U.S. environment, ground's been lost. Yes.
Yeah.
This is something we can do. It's the most important thing any environmentalist can do for the planet. Look at the huge difference it makes. I mean, if you add up those numbers, 1,100 gallons of water a day, you know, that's huge.
Incredible. Yeah.
You can do it today, you know, and you can do it in the next meal you have. You know, you don't have to do it every meal. Don't beat yourself up if you don't do it all the time, or you feel like a friend was telling us yesterday, she just seems to do better if she has meat about every 10 days. All right, you know, that's what you need to do. That's a huge improvement over having it 3 times a day. Yeah. But also I wanted to say that this movement is growing rapidly. And this sounds a little idealistic. There was a movie recently produced on BBC called Carnage, about, you know, what if the UK went vegan by 2064 or something like that. It's kind of funny with little pyramids in the background, and everybody kind of it's just a little baby lamb. It's just a lamb, it's a little baby lamb, you know. Anyway, they can't understand how anyone would ever have done that, but check it out, Carnage. But anyway, the fact is that if someone's done some figures, like, if every person who went plant-based or more plant-based, let's say near vegan, convinced just one other person a year to do that, in the US, for example, the number we have now, in 10 years, everybody would be vegan. Just do the power of doubling. I mean, talk with other people about it, you know, it's a cultural change that needs to happen. Yeah. It's not a political change, it's a cultural change.
Yeah, and I might add, you know, it's an obvious thing, but if we come to understand that some of these things that are being sold and used in our culture are not really the best for us or for our animals or for the environment, it's a very simple thing to stop buying them. Because if there's no market, they're not going to make it anymore.
Yeah.
Someone says also, do you think this maybe is too time consuming? That's what puts people off. Yeah, I can see why you would say that, but cooking for yourself takes time. I mean, if you want to eat out, you know, right? This is where we're saying just the same foods you cook for yourself. But if you want a healthy diet, you've got to cook for yourself, right? So you've got to cook something there, so you can feed the same thing to your dog if you just understand how to proportionalize it and add some supplements or whatever to make sure you get everything that they need. But it's really not that hard, and the Instant Pot makes it helpful. Planning ahead, doing a cook up, you know, maybe, and freezing some stuff. I mean, if you have a bunch of big dogs, yeah, it's going to be harder, but it's going to be cheaper too. I mean, you can cook large amounts. Again, Anne Heritage of Somerset fed 5 large dogs the same thing. She would just put it in the big stew pot and would go for about an hour, and then she'd feed it to them. So it's just lentils and rice, and once you get the routine down, it's really quick. You know, it's not that long to do it. You just have to plan it in advance. Here somebody says, I resisted for years even though she knew about the accumulation of toxins because she saw how well they did on the raw diet, but now I see they're doing even better, but they get a lot of raw vegetables and fruits, so, and all organic, and shares green drinks. So yeah, you know, if you've been feeding your dog the raw meat diet, you know, a lot of the reason it has been doing better is because you are feeding the same thing for people too that are doing paleo. they're eating a lot of raw fruits and vegetables, which are very rich in healthy phytonutrients and antioxidants that help you fight cancer and a lot of chronic disease. So, and smoothies, you can share smoothies with your dog, yeah.
Yeah, there's actually a lot you can share, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that certainly made me want to sit down and, you know, look through some of these recipes that look absolutely delicious anyway. And
good. You might think about something you could have for for lunch or something tomorrow. We're about to have lunch here, and it makes me getting hungry. The tofu nut loaf. I guess you guys probably have good access to tofu in the UK. We do here.
Yeah.
Get organic, definitely, yes. Yeah. And it's combined with, and you have, I think, better quality bread there than we do, in terms of the glyphosate and all that. So, yeah, you just basically mix tofu with breadcrumbs and oats and some seasonings, and it's really easy to do. Top it maybe with some ketchup, or you can use a gravy. We have gravy options in our book too, based on things like nuts and seeds like tahini and so on, that are all tasty. And you can even make a gravy out of potatoes, actually, and nutritional yeast and herbs and stuff. It's fun to learn this stuff. It is. So
you say it's learning new stuff. As Leslie said, do you think there's a connection between a raw diet and stomach ulcers when feeding raw meat?
Well, I don't have an opinion. Do you?
Connection with raw diet and stomach. Well, again, I don't want to just keep harping on mercury, because it's not the only substance that is, there's hundreds of things found in food, heavy metals as well as other chemicals. So we don't know necessarily it's any one thing, but I do happen to know that one of the symptoms of mercury is ulceration of the stomach and intestines, as well as other parts of the body. So certainly it's possible. Again, see, we don't, I don't know how to put this. It's an odd thing. We have, as a culture, we have produced some of these chemicals and substances to use, and then in knowing to some degree that they're going to go out into the environment. But we've never really looked at what they will do when they come back to us. It's like we haven't really looked at the health effects of these substances. And when I have contacted years ago, when I've contacted companies about testing of some of these substances that are used in medicine, and I ask about what possible effects they might have, say animal products, veterinary products, what would it do to a child or a person? When I ask those questions, they say, well, they're not intended for people, but we don't have to test it. See, that's the attitude. So there's a lot of stuff out there that we just don't know. If there's 100,000 chemicals in use, you can see how much ignorance is there. We just don't really know what they do, any one of them, really. And then even more so, what do they do when they're combined together? And there's 100 of them in the body. You see the problem? Mm-hmm. And these studies just simply aren't being done because as a culture, we do not yet have enough interest in it as a factor of health.
But we're going to have to, though. Or we're going to at least have, again, there's an imperative here. We're not going to have a lot of choice. When we start running out of water, we start running out of a viable
going back
soil.
For example, to me, it's an obvious thing. I don't know how you guys would hear it, but let's say you take like I mentioned, how much cancer there is now, how it's a growing epidemic in animals and people. Well, it's obviously not a genetic problem. There's not enough time for that to develop. So it's going to be an environmental cause. Do we look at that seriously as why it's increasing every year? How about hyperthyroidism in cats that didn't exist 30 years ago, and now it's an epidemic?
When Richard started practice, things were very different in 1965.
Yeah. When I started in practicing in 65, cats had no gum inflammation or mouth problems. And now look at how much of it there is. Well, a lot of this is environmental toxicity. And the veterinary profession is simply not looking at this factor. It's just not of interest to them. I'm generalizing. There are some that are interested, of course. There's a few. But the profession as a whole is just not that interested in it as a consideration.
I want to kind of stick my neck out a little bit here too and say that without naming a particular product, one of Richard's clients recently had a high-end nutritional supplement made for dogs analyzed, it was extraordinarily high in, was it mercury? Like
Arsenic.
arsenic, 2,400 times. We showed you some things where it was 120 times the reference dosage limit for humans. It was like way up there. So
this client's cats were getting every day a dose that was 2,500 times the acceptable maximum dose for humans of arsenic.
Wow.
Yeah. This is the kind of thing. See, this is what we need to be looking at. The food quality and the contamination of food is really important to look at. And so that has to be, we have to give attention to it. Instead of looking for drugs and doing research for drugs to try to, control symptoms, why don't we give a serious look at what might be causing these things?
Yeah, well, and there's a lot of conflict of interest here. The people who made the movie Cowspiracy, which again we highly recommend, recently made a follow-up called What the Health, and it looks at the collusion between the big pharma, big medicine, and big agriculture as well. That there's a lot of money involved in convincing you that you've got to eat meat, you've got to eat dairy to for a healthy body and all that kind of stuff. And there's no money to be made in convincing you to eat more broccoli, or to feed to your dog. There's just no money there. So follow the money. Consider that factor. And we recommend again that movie is very eye-opening. It's called What the Health, like what the hell.
Yeah.
And I think Mary Beth Mentor is on this call and has been feeding tofu and says her dog loves the tofu meatloaf, and so does she. Richard loves it too. I have to say. And Mary Beth has been very encouraging, and she's really, as a veterinarian, she's been encouraging. So Richard's retired from practice, okay, but she's been out there on the front lines encouraging people to try this with their dogs and getting good results. Some people resist it because there is such indoctrination at this point, about the raw diet, being like the only way to do it, even though historically this is really a pretty new thing. People couldn't afford really to feed much meat to dogs except for the kings or whatever. And days yore. Go ahead.
So there's a question here about adding supplements. Supplements can be useful. We prefer, the first step would be to use organically raised foods because it's the most nutritious. And if supplements need to be used, use whole supplements like brewer's yeast and other things rather than isolated supplements, which are, first of all, probably questionable now as far as the quality. A lot of them have been found to not be as good as they thought they were, coming from other countries, coming from China and so on. So I would say first emphasize the food, the best quality food, organic food, whole food, as much as you can. And start with that as your foundation. You'll find oftentimes it's sufficient.
Yeah, it's important to realize that food comes in a matrix, and we used to kind of think more in terms of vitamins and, taking supplements and all that. I think a lot of people did. But there's been a lot of research now finding that things can become imbalanced. So it's better to use whole foods, whereas the less processing, the better. And the more organic, the better. There have been studies finding that nutrients declining. One thing we didn't cover on this webinar, nutrients are declining in our food supply due to rapid growth. Too much fertilizer, too much breeding for fast growth, whether it's plants or animals, and then destroying the soil so that the microbes aren't there to kind of help the plants take in the minerals. So there's as much as 50% or more decline in various minerals in the soil. So it does make a difference. So if it's organic, so we encourage you to use organic food as much as possible. Grow your own if you can. One thing we did find in common, I noticed talking with different people who've been feeding plant-based diets, whether they fed kibble or whether they fed the same thing over and over again, or whether it's fed a varied diet, I think there was one that a lot of them were feeding greens and vegetables and things like that supplemented to the diet. So it seems like that's an important thing. I know it is for people. And it seems to be important for dogs as well.
Just kind of wind up, are there any support groups, like Facebook groups for people that want to feed their dogs a vegan diet?
Yeah. There's one, I think it's called Vegan Dogs. I think there's another one called Vegan Dogs Thriving. There's a vegan veterinarian site. Just start looking around online and you'll find something. There's one for cats and so forth too. There's one that's against it for cats on Facebook. It's interesting that some people who are vegans resist this message, actually, because of the idea of it being unnatural and cruel and so on. But, you know, how natural is it to have a little tiny chihuahua? You know, it's like, instead of a wolf, to confine it. And would it eat cow, really, when you feed it some, you know, beef or something like that? Not really. So there's a lot of things we do that are unnatural already. So, you know.
Yeah. So
evolution adapts. That's one of the messages in our book too this time, is that what's natural and holistic. What's natural is for life to change. What's natural is for evolution to evolve. That and holistic is to consider the well-being of all beings on the planet. So we're expanding that definition. And we feel we have the right to do that. We're old farts now, and we've been at this for a while, so I feel like we have a right to do that and say that, you know. So why not?
Yeah. So if anybody has any more questions, please type in the box. Otherwise, we will look to wind up there. I think it's been absolutely fascinating. It certainly made me want to go, you know, think about this more. It's kind of challenged my thinking, and I think perhaps given me the confidence to actually take that step, because I kind of knew about this stuff, but it's just taking that step forward. So
also there's been a lot of pioneers that have come before us. I mean, really, I mean, we through the years, even when we did our first edition of our book, we weren't the first ones to do what we did. We just popularized it more. Like Julia de Barclay-Levy was all about, you know, feeding raw meat and stuff to dogs, and we weren't sure it would work, because back in those days, you know, all you had to do was feed kibble to dogs, like what the veterinarians were brainwashed to believe. So we're doing the same thing. We're following in the footsteps of the pioneers, and we're validating it, and we're kind of doing research, and we're testing it out, and we don't ourselves have a dog right now, but we've been sharing these recipes with friends that do, and they're doing great on them. So it's exciting.
Yeah, well, I think if anybody does try it, then obviously, you know, I'm sure you'd love to hear the feedback, because sometimes you kind of have to take the plunge and just say, well, actually, what's it doing to my? Is it actually helping them?
Right.
So
and adjustments as needed, you know, and kind of don't just give up if your dog throws up or vomits or something. Do dogs have a lot of wind on this diet?
I mean, that's a good one to end on.
Yeah, well, we do. Yeah, no, legumes. I mean, if there's too much, you can always throw in some more, you know, use digestive enzymes or cook. There's different ways to cook beans, particularly. And fiber also will produce, you know, more fiber in a diet will produce more gas. I mean, it's not necessarily an unhealthy thing. You know, it's like very natural to a cow, right? So, I wish, if Mary Beth, I don't know if you can say something to that. If you can type something in there if you're listening still.
I think I'll just take her off mute if I can.
Oh, okay. You there, Mary Beth? Aha. She says, you can help spell there's a dog a bit.
There's Rudy. He just said yes. I'm sorry. He hears everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, well, you know, it depends. I think they get used to it. And I haven't really had issues with my own dog with a lot of gas. I mean, I think it's more like their stool will be more bulky and softer in a lot of situations, which can be good. I mean, especially if a dog's not been pooping a lot or they have anal gland issues, it helps open the anal gland, you know, stretch the anal sphincter and they empty the gland. That's a benefit a lot of times that people will mention. But I you know, if there is gas, then certainly maybe use some digestive enzymes.
Mm-hmm. With your clients, have you found that are trying this, have you found this as a complaint very much?
Not really. Not too much lately. It depends on the dog. It would, you know, depend on if the dog is maybe having some trouble digesting in general. You know, I'm also using homeopathy too. Mm-hmm. But it really, the joke is sort of like gas, but I think it's, people think that. I can't say that's really been a lot. I mean, maybe some foods more, but it's not a big problem. Yeah,
and if you can identify certain foods, maybe, you know, or if it seemed to have problems or whatever. What about vomiting? Have you found much with that?
No,
Good.
I mean, no, not at all. I think it helps a lot of animals that have been vomiting because they're, not doing well with the other foods.
And can you give your opinion also on that question that was asked earlier about the cooked versus raw vegetables?
Oh, well, I think some of it's like some dogs really like raw, but I think, definitely like if it shows up in their stool, watch their stool. If you see pieces of like carrot or other foods, that means maybe you need to either blend it more or you definitely cook it. Yeah, you would want to cook things like potatoes and yams and
things that ordinarily are cooked.
Citrus vegetables. I mean, sometimes I'll just like in the tofu loaf, Susan, I'll just like kind of grate some carrot raw and some beet, but it kind of cooks in there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's and I got that report from another person too that's been using the tofu meatloaf, and she puts in things like butternut squash and so forth into it also, and her dog really loves that one. Yeah. Just be careful when you add. Don't worry about it too much. But I mean, if you're looking at these recipes and it's like right on the borderline of being enough protein, you have to be careful not to add too much more starchy vegetables or whatever to it without maybe increasing the protein source. That's all I would comment on that. When you modify, people always want to modify our recipes, I notice. So somebody says, what about steaming vegetables? Are you still there, Mary Beth?
Yeah, that's good. Steaming is good.
Yeah, definitely.
If you like if you do the cook pot thing, I mean, if you put the vegetables in, it all kind of cooks together. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the commercial cans, which there are more and more good ones, they're all cooked, right? It sort of becomes more like, a cooked product. Yeah, it can look like that, certainly. And some dogs, depending on their taste, some of them want a little more fresh. I mean, or just see what your dog likes. They definitely have tastes they do and don't like.
Yeah, they vary too. I mean,
by season too. Like what's fresh, and they can tell like what's fresh in the summer. And like our dog likes figs and fruits in the summer, but not.
I was going to add just maybe help understanding of this question, cooked versus raw. It's not. We're saying that dogs have, say for example, going back to grains or carbohydrates. They have as much enzyme to do that as humans do. That's been determined. The difference is that the dog's gastrointestinal tract, its intestines, are only about a third as long as humans. Oh, right. So it's not that they can't digest it. It's just for some things that are slow to digest, they go through it before they get finished, if you will, end up in stool. So if you cook it first, it sort of pre-digests it. It makes it digest faster once it gets to the stomach and into the intestinal tract. So if you find that you're doing some vegetables, you're blending or grating up raw and they're coming through the stool, then they just are, it's not that the dog can't digest it exactly so much as it is that it hasn't had time to. So then if you cook it first or steam it, that breaks it down somewhat so it's more easily taken in. Does that make sense?
And back to the question, I've also on legumes, I just wanted to add that rinsing them several times, adding either a piece of kombu, a sweet seaweed, or a piece of potato is often recommended to reduce the gas and take off some of the chemicals that kind of tend to produce that, and remove it from the beans before you serve it. Some people use baking soda. I'm not really sure about that particular one. Sounds a little strange to me, but that's supposed to be an old trick also to reduce gas in beans.
What about juicing? Do you ever juice for your dogs?
Some people do that. We tend to believe that it's better to, if you're choosing between like a smoothie and juicing, it'd be better to do the smoothie because you're not losing the fiber, you're not losing some of the nutrients that might be there on the skin or still retained in the vegetable. So there's a prominent nutritionist, T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University, who's written a book called Whole. And he really argues very strongly and intelligently for the importance of whole foods. So we don't necessarily even say that we're eating ourselves a vegan diet, we're eating a whole food, plant-based diet. So we don't particularly advocate a lot of these fake meats and fake cheeses and things like that. I mean, they're good for transition. They're okay, you know, but you don't want to live off of that or have your animal live off of that either. Even if you had a little Chihuahua and you could afford to do that, it'd be better to feed more fresh foods that are whole. I mean, particularly, like, for example, some people have a complaint now. I'm surprised it hasn't even come up about soy foods. I mean, soy's gotten a bad rap. It used to have a good rap. It's gotten a bad rap in the last few years. And the few studies that have shown any problems with soy seem to be using isolates, like soy protein isolates. So you might want
probably not organic.
Yeah, and probably not organic. So they haven't really compared those two things either. So, but the thyroid issues and all these kinds of estrogen issues, that's all bogus stuff. If you look it up, Google is soy safe online, and you'll see several good articles on that by experts who know something about it.
The other thing to keep in mind is if you see a study that somebody refers to where they've said that soy causes some problems, if you look at the study, oftentimes they're not using organic. So, and then yet at the same time, the people that did the research aren't even thinking of something like glyphosate from Roundup in the soy, you see. They just ignore it. So it's not really fair to say, oh, well, the soy itself is harmful in some way, if they're not considering how clear the source is to start with. You see, that's why some of these studies are confusing or contradictory.
Yeah.
And you'll find that when you look at it carefully, you'll find almost never do they use organic foods when they do their evaluations.
And studies that have been done that have shown, like, giving children, grade school children, organic foods for just like a couple of weeks, I think it was, versus their tissues tested much more clear of different urine of toxins in a short time. So it does make a difference.
Yeah, one study of children over a period of 2 weeks fed organic had a markedly drop in the amount of chemicals in their urine.
Yeah, somebody adds that T. Colin Campbell said the anti-soy propaganda, a lot of it's coming from the meat and dairy industry. I think that's probably true. You see a lot of it on the Weston Price Foundation, in particular, who seems to have a real anti-soy, anti-vegetarian agenda, and they are largely supported by the small, humane, whatever, meat and dairy farmers.
Another interesting thing is about soy is oftentimes you hear people say, oh, it has estrogen in it. Well, first of all, it's a plant estrogen. It doesn't act in people, or it acts very, very little, if it does at all. And secondly, the amount of estrogen in dairy products is many, many, many times what's in soy.
And it's real estrogen. I mean, it's
real
estrogen. It's mammalian estrogen.
Yes, it acts in humans and
not a
dogs and cats.
It's much more potent.
Yeah.
And one thing to remember that I never realized as a lacto-ovo-vegetarian for like 40 years is that, and this sounds stupid, but to not realize this, but to have, for a cow or a goat or anything to give milk, it has to have given birth to a baby. And that means pretty much every year they have to be made pregnant through artificial insemination, which is what's called the rape rack. And generally nowadays, the young calf or lamb or whatever is taken away from mom immediately, and with much distress for both of them. You can't separate. So the mother's either pregnant, I mean, the one's giving milk, pregnant, or just gave birth, and the estrogen levels are really high in the milk. And that's appropriate, for feeding the young. But also think about this, as far as dairy goes. How natural is it for an adult of any species to continue drinking milk after weaning? Why do we do that? And why do we think we need milk from another species? It might have made some sense at some points in northern climates, during the winter when they had animals were grazing or whatever. Like in Northern Europe, I mean, there's a lot of dairy consumption there, but 75% of humans around the world are lactose intolerant. I mean, and milk is one of the big allergens also in dogs and cats.
Yeah.
To have milk after weaning. So.
Yeah, but we were kind of brought up on it at school. We used to have a bottle of milk.
Get your milk mustache and everything. And in fact, there's a lot of in the U.S. There's a lot of infiltration in schools. They put actually big ads up on the gym or whatever about milk does a body good and so forth. And there's a lot of collusion going on there and a lot of misunderstanding. And and during World War II, when people in Scandinavia were deprived of dairy products and meat, actually a lot of things improved, like osteoporosis declined and things like that. There's things that are kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And other parameters improved, and then when they went back on their usual diet, it got worse again.
Studies have shown that the women that use dairy products have more osteoporosis than women that do not. And
the reason that's thought for that is that when you're that it acidifies the body basically to have dairy products and meat, and that this means that the body has to take out calcium to buffer the acid in the blood, and that this is what's it actually takes out as much calcium as it's giving you. And calcium is not the only thing in what makes a healthy bone. It's really a matrix of protein that's there, and it includes other minerals and so forth. So pure calcium is chalk, and it's pretty crumbly stuff. So there's a lot of things that we need to re-examine.
Yeah.
In general, Richard and I met years ago at a Krishnamurti conference, and it's kind of been a theme of our lives to, like he sort of taught for many years, to question things, to inquire. Don't just take things on authority. And that includes a lot of the people who question things. Sometimes people question things and it becomes a fad, and it's not. It just becomes repeated. A phrase that's repeated, like, "Oh, soy's bad," or "wheat's bad," or whatever. Mary Beth is an example. Was telling us that she used to, she was tested to be celiac positive or whatever. I shouldn't say this personal, but anyway. But she does fine with wheat now. It's like you just we're more adaptable than we think.
Yes, I think we are. Okay, well, I think we will wind up there. I think it's been absolutely fascinating. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you both. Obviously, wish you all the best with the new book, or the fourth edition book, which looks fantastic, and hopefully, I'd love to hear from anybody who actually does try this, and give you some feedback, because it would be really interesting to just see if it helps us, if it helps our dogs, if it sorts out any of the the medical issues that we've got. So
we wish you all well, and we wish you courage and also integrity in what you do, and just know that this can be a very joyful thing to do. It feels really good to live in alignment with your values of caring for all animals and caring for the world that we live in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye now.